There were over 1,200 digital media reports of that gathering, almost one for every one of us there. One key reason that the May attack on the flotilla generated a rapid and internationally broad outcry was the December protests in Cairo. But part of the well-orchestrated response by the governments of Israel, Egypt, and the United States to claim a high moral ground of international law linked to a threat of global terrorism is also evidence of a closely linked learning curve to begin a rhetorical rebuttal even before there is an actionable event. If you're on the FOR mailing list, you've just received your spring appeal. And that appeal opens with the story of the Martin Luther King comic book, the Montgomery Bus Story, published by FOR in 1959 as a way of capturing the successful use of nonviolent strategies and tactics in the civil rights movement. You will also probably have noticed that in the events in Egypt this spring, the Arab Spring, the revolution in Tahrir Square, one of the pieces of literature distributed throughout the square was an Arabic translation of the Montgomery Bus Story, the comic book produced by FOR, as one of the tools of teaching the tactics of nonviolence, one of many. So that history is threaded through in very powerful ways. So the movement is alive with the logistical capacity to engage global issues in contested environments and across broad cultural ranges. But the impunity of the state to take lives as its response to the challenges of the peace movement suggests that the peace movement is not entirely well. The gap between civil society and even the most democratically elected governments is expanding, just as the gap between the rich and the poor as a part of the global economy is growing. And these are integrally related gaps. The facility of digital media and the focus on universal human rights have globalized the peace movement. I'm not, for the purposes of this argument, going to make fine distinctions between the peace movement and the anti-war movement. And they've accelerated the rhetorical response to injustice. And yet, the evidence of successful actions is lacking. And the experience of the movement in the United States is highly ambiguous in terms of effectiveness. This is partly because the movement has failed to sustain and deepen recognition of the nexus identified by Martin Luther King Jr. in April 1967, and others before and since, between the costs of war abroad and the disintegration of economic well-being at home. Under the stress of recession, the government uses the lever of enlistment as a magnet for creating commitment, if not loyalty, to warring among the economically most depressed. A fragile global economy resting on fractured monetary policies and overextended credit structures, on pension funds imbued with weapons manufacturers and trade, and a more generally militarized economy, and small circles of decision makers beyond the reach of regulators and the public interest, which retains an almost magical capacity to maintain the status quo and to diffuse the peace movement. A catalog of tests of the capacity to bring the witness of the peace movement to bear on injustices today would range across the world and would include the fate of indigenous farmers and agrarian peace communities on the borders of the rainforest in Latin America. It would include communities of various ethnicities, religions, and gender orientations in Africa. The contests of occupation throughout the Middle East, communities of resistance in Sri Lanka, India, and China, anti-militarists in Japan, and victims of structural violence, epitomized by a racially corrupted justice system in the United States. Each reference in that list will have triggered an image of violence and oppression, and brought to mind a web-based campaign using tactics of petitions, letter writings, demonstrations, fundraising, a calendar of liturgical reflection and prayer. Beyond these educational and awareness-building efforts, which provide the opportunity for impulse compassion, there are methods that involve more substantive commitments, additional training, and institutionalized support. The most active efforts or tools of response are civilian diplomacy, protective accompaniment, Track 2 dialogue and negotiation, and a nascent and nervous conversation across the bridges that link peacemaking to peace building to humanitarian assistance, and humanitarian assistance to a sanitized military agenda. The continuum can be seen as one of increasing commitment and heightened risk-taking by the participants. Please come on in, there's a seat right up here. It's good to see Anna Owens here, who is one of those civilian diplomats to Iran with FOR, like Terry Taylor, an earlier delegation. Civilian diplomacy gained some prominence during the Cold War, when Western civilizations traveled to the Soviet Union on exchanges for the trust building amongst peoples. Samantha Smith gave the practice tragic attention when she and her father died in an air crash returning from England, where a film was being made of her contacts, and her work was celebrated by Mikhail Gorbachev and Ronald Reagan. The practice of sending delegations prepped for public exchanges and primed for a transformative visit abroad that lends and leads to a legitimation of advocacy for peace has been tested for decades throughout the world, including notable engagements with Nicaragua, the Philippines, South Africa, Cuba, and today, Iran. Next week, our 13th delegation leaves with 7 people for 2 weeks in Iran. Interfaith Peace Builders, Witness for Peace, and the Fellowship of Reconciliation delegations are among current practitioners in Latin America, Israel, Palestine, and Iran. Some efforts focus on culture, such as the annual conference in Fez, Morocco. Others focus more specifically on interreligious dialogue, such as those hosted by the Center for Interfaith Dialogue in Iran, which has hosted FOR delegations during the past 3 years. Protective accompaniment is a response to an invitation from communities at risk from conflicts among forces often including the military, the paramilitary, and armed resistance groups to support community leaders when they leave the relative security of their homes to travel on official business through conflict zones. Peace Brigades International, Christian Peacemaker Teams, the Swedish FOR, the Presbyterian Peace Fellowship, and FOR maintain protective accompaniment teams in Colombia. CPT has also used the practice in Palestine, Iraq, Mexico, with indigenous Americans and parts of Africa. An Abdul Ghaffar Khan-inspired global cadre of trained accompaniers organized through the Nonviolent Peace Force represents the fullest extension of this vision, though the challenges of securing adequate funding constrains its complete implementation.